Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. In addition to supporting me on Locals, you can also support me on Buy Me a Coffee and Subscribestar. And as per usual, around 45 minutes, I'll begin the process of engaging with the chat. Super chats will be read first, and other chats will be read as time permits and their relevance to this discussion. Now, while I didn't necessarily label this as an AMA, I will be taking questions as well, since this is more of a explanation or a presentation of my own political framework of analysis, right? So this isn't to necessarily be seen as this is Todd's ideal government, but more like, given how in my recent Moldbug streams, I've been criticizing Moldbug's classification system and Moldbug's understanding of political structures. Well, what do I offer instead? Because I think a lot of people are sort of left scratching their heads, like, what exactly am I presenting? So I'm going to do that here. So this is more of a model for understanding political differences rather than a preferred political system. And again, this question seems to have come up in light of my recent Moldbug videos. And I see we have in the chat Minoan, Voltra, and Evidence Violates Community Guidelines. Hello, everyone. So we'll start with the fact that the basic framework that I will be using is basically derived from classical and then early modern rediscovery of classical texts. So obviously we have Plato. He wrote 3 major works on politics: The Republic, The Laws, and The Statesman. I've only read parts of The Republic. So this isn't to be understood as a detailed explanation of these ancient thinkers and all of their political nuances, but more from those that I've read, how that has then shaped the framework that I use. So I am somewhat familiar with at least the arguments about, especially in Book 8 of The Republic, about the societies that degrade. Aristotle wrote The Politics. That's his main work on government, and I've read that twice. Fragments of Cicero's The Republic exist, and I've read that once. Machiavelli sort of popularizes a lot of these classical ideas in the Discourse on Livy, which I had to read for college. And we see these ideas even taken forward into the American Revolution with the Founding Fathers. So we'll start with the Republic. The big idea in the Republic, of course, is that Plato's talking about justice, and that he uses the idea, well, what does justice look like in the soul? And then he says, well, let's use an extended analogy of the city. And this is where he comes up with the sort of abstract types. So Book 8 of the Republic is not meant to be taken as like this literal regime. Well, it might be a future literal regime that Plato envisions as an ideal, but it's not one that is actually currently developed yet. And then it's stages of decline. So it's a sort of like very well thought out alternative political system with the understanding that in all likelihood it will degrade over time. And it's these degrading over time aspects that I think are important for what I'm talking about. The first form of government is the aristocracy, the Caligulus, which is the rule of the philosopher kings who basically have the noble lie, telling people where they came from, where their class position is oriented based on a parable about metal, from valuable metal, gold, down to base metal like lead. And then lower down you are, the more base of the metal you are, the lower your class is. And they, the guardians and the philosopher kings control the breeding of the citizen body. So through a quote unquote random lottery, only the best reproduce. But then that's only as a setup for how it decays. Plato believes that this decay will happen in the same way that a well-ordered soul becomes discordant, and that the metals will be mixed, primarily the philosophers and the guardians, which will then lead to, and the guardians, of course, are the martial class, the class of iron. And so from Plato's idea of the ideal good and the ultimate good, this then decays down to a lesser good, the good of honor. Democracy means the rule of those who pursue honor. How does democracy devolve? Well, he argues that like a man, young men desire honor, old men desire wealth. So he places democracy as a sort of young man's government. But as that government ages, he speculates that they will then desire wealth. Wealth is a sign of, can be seen as a sign of power and prestige and privilege without having to actually had to earn it. And it's the shortcut which leads to the oligarchy, where that is valued as an end in itself rather than what it signified, honor and prestige. Oligarchy, the rule of the rich, then devolves. You have one generation that had to work for the money, but as soon as wealth becomes abundant, successive generations don't have to work for it. They take it as a matter of course and a given, and they pursue luxury and indolent living. But also, as wealth is centralized in the hands of fewer and fewer people, most of the population becomes pauperized, and as elites fall out of favor because of debts or conflict, this then leads to a revolutionary crisis where the democratic government then takes over and expropriates their wealth and redistributes it. Now, what the aristocracy, democracy, and oligarchy all have is a sense of a common good, common value, even if honor and wealth are less good than the good of the philosopher kings. Democracy, according to Plato, doesn't have any of that, and that it's just, appetites in competition with each other. And then that leads to chaos and anarchy, social order being turned upside down. And then that leads to the tyrant. The tyrant is motivated by the desire for gain and pleasure, just like the mob. He seeks power by violence, just like the mob did from the oligarchs, but this time he uses it against them. But also because there's a power vacuum, his authoritarianism is, in some sense, necessary in order to restore order. And so this decay that we see goes from an ideal set of principles for a normative good to a set of flawed principles, honor and wealth, but still a normative good, and then the rejection of any normative good at all, which finally devolves into the rule of the appetites of one man. That's my takeaway from Plato's Republic. And we see this even now in our own day, right, with the wealth and superabundance that boomers and Xers had, leading to this kind of state of affairs in a democracy that Plato talks about. Now, Aristotle, this is the one that's been most influential for me. There's really a couple things that need to be understood. First of all, the Politics is the sequel to the Nicomachean Ethics, which discusses virtue and friendship. And the question then arises, well, how do we encourage these values in individuals? Aristotle says through education. Education comes from the state. So then he talks about what is the ideal kind of state in order to do this. So the first thing that needs to be defined is virtue and vice. Virtue, well, there's four of them: prudence, justice, temperance, and courage. Prudence is doing the right thing for the right reason at the right time. Justice is giving one's desert, which Plato objects to in the Republic, but Aristotle says is the definition of justice. Temperance is moderation, following this middle course in life, not too much, not too little. And then courage is doing what is right, even when it's difficult. The example Aristotle gives is that of a soldier, but one might envision, say, from Sophocles' play, The Antigone. Antigone does what is right in the face of her uncle, even if that means risking death, because doing what is right is more important than life itself. And then vice is acting in accordance with the passions and desires without the care or concern for others. Aristotle then makes a distinction between what he calls three forms of government: the rule of the one, the rule of the few, and the rule of the many. The rule of the one, in its virtuous form, is a monarchy, and that's basically defined by a king of the same ethnos as his people ruling, as well as having an army recruited from his own ethnos, as well as governing in the, quote, common good. A tyrant, then, is someone who rules in his own interest with foreign troops in order to cow his own people. So the goal is different, and the mode of government is different. Aristocracy is, again, the rule of the many for the common good. Oligarchy, in this case, is not the same as Plato's oligarchy. They might be rich, they might be some other form of status, but it's just the rule of the many with orientation towards self-interest rather than the common good. And then we have the rule of the many, which is virtuous, what is called politia. He identifies that with the early Athenian constitution of Solon. And then democracy, which is the degraded form. So I guess in that sense, he would agree with Plato. But the word politia is the idea that all popular government is bad is sort of a mistake. At least not all classical thinkers thought that. And in fact, one of the problems with the politics is that because these are notes taken by Aristotle's students, there isn't always a consistent use throughout. So, for example, he talks about the values of a mixed constitution, and that's going to be an important point we'll get to later. which in his context is just an oligarchy and a democracy, so the rule of the many and the rule of the few, without any sort of obvious moral connotation, given that he put on those words earlier. Because he says the best form of government is a mixed government, which if he's talking about best in this moral sense, then we would have expected the notes to say an aristocracy and a polity. But it's an oligarchy and a democracy, so that's just more of an abstract signification. And then we have the Roman system of government, which we have a line from Polybius to Cicero to Machiavelli, which I'll explain, which is a threefold governing structure. So to sort of give you the understanding, in Ecclesiastes 4:12, we read, though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him, and the threefold cord is not quickly broken. So this idea of three and strength and balance is found throughout. The Roman bundle of sticks with an axe, the fasces, is a sign of strength and unity. You can break one stick, but if three sticks are held together, it's much more difficult to break them. Machiavelli, in Book 6 of his Histories, gives us an account of the Roman government. So he's not arguing from first principles why we should have this government. He's not arguing how it came to be. He's merely describing it. And this is where we get the idea of the mixed constitution. I mean, we already see it in a germinal form with Aristotle, but he's giving us a descriptive account of Roman governance, the consul, which is royal, the Senate, which is aristocratic, and the people, which is democratic. If any one of the three gets out of line, then the other two can join forces to bring it back to the center. The equality and balance between the three contending forces is the goal of the Roman constitution, according to Polybius. Polybius says in his own day it was so well balanced, which is during and after the Second Punic War, that it was difficult, it defied classification. Hence, this gives rise to Cicero's need for a fourth form of government. According to Polybius, the Roman constitution, the consul was supreme master of administration. Everyone submitted to his judgment. He had there were two of them, just like Sparta's two kings. The consuls had total control in military affairs of lands outside of Italia. In the late stages of the decayed republic, in his Lives of Pompey and Caesar, Plutarch talks about how they had absolute rule on the sea, and Caesar in Europe with Gaul and Britain, and then Pompey in the east with Italy, or with Turkey, Palestine, Syria, and Egypt. And of course, what ends up happening then is these absolute rules outside of the empire, outside of Italy, turn in, and that leads to the Civil War. The Senate controlled the purse strings and adjudicates criminal matters in Italy. And then the people voted on giving honors to men, to sit in judgment in court, to have power in signing and repealing laws, and having power in declaring and ending wars. And this was the balanced constitution that Polybius describes the Romans as having. He's not giving an account of how it developed, but just what it was. In the fragments that we have of Cicero's The Republic, or the Politics, the Republic rather, he speaks of the need for a fourth kind of government. And I'll read from paragraph 29 of the fragments. And this great mischief arises whether under the rule of the better classes, or under a tyrannical faction, or under the regal government, and even frequently under the popular form. At the same time, from various forms of government of which I have spoken, something excellent is wont to emanate. For the changes and vicissitudes in public affairs appear to move in a circle of revolutions, which when recognized by a wise man, as soon as he beholds them impending, if he can moderate their course in the administration of affairs and restrain them under his control, he acts truly the part of a great citizen and almost of a divine man. Therefore, I think a fourth kind of government, moderated and fixed from these three of which I spoke, is most to be approved. Now, well, Aristotle does give us the idea of a mixed constitution in its final form, having elements of the rule of the one, or the royal power, because there's technically two consuls in the Roman system, the rule of the few, the aristocratic power is in the Senate, and the rule of the many, the people, is in the hands of the tribunate. And so the Roman constitution is well balanced. What we have is now a brief reading of Machiavelli's The Discourse of Livy on Rome and its constitution. But let us come to Rome, notwithstanding that it did not have a lycurgus to order it in the beginning in a mode that would enable it to live a free, long time. Nevertheless, so many accidents arose in it through the disunion between the plebs and the Senate, that what an orderer had not done, chance did. For if the first fortune did not fall to Rome, the second fell to it. For his first orders were defective, nevertheless they did not deviate from the right way that could lead them to perfection. For Romulus and all the other kings made many and good laws, conforming also to a free way of life. But because their end was to found a kingdom, not a republic, when that city was left free, many things that were necessary to order in favor of freedom were lacking, not having been ordered by these kings. Even though its kings lost their empire by their causes and modes discordant nonetheless, those who expelled them from Rome, the name and not the kingly power, having at once ordered 2 consuls, there stood in the place of the kings, having at once ordered 2 consuls there who stood. So since there were the consuls in the Senate and that republic, it came to be mixed, only of 2 qualities out of the 3 written above, that is, the principality and the aristocrats. It remained only to give a place to the popular government. Hence, when the Roman nobility became insolent for the causes that will be told below, the people rose up against it so as not to lose the whole. It was constrained to yield to the people in its part. And on the other side, the Senate and the consuls remained with so much authority that they could keep their rank in the republic. Thus arose the creation of the tribunes of the plebs, after which the state of the republic came to be more stabilized, since all 3 kinds of government there had their part. Fortune was so favorable to it that although it passed from the government of kings and of aristocrats to that of the people, by the same degrees and for the same causes that have been discoursed of above, nevertheless it never took away all authority from kingly qualities, so as to give authority to the aristocrats, nor did it diminish the authority of the aristocrats altogether, so as to give it to the people. But remaining mixed, it made a perfect republic, to which perfection it came through the disunion of the plebs in the Senate, as will be demonstrated at length in the next 2 chapters. And that was book 1, chapter 2 of the Discourse on Livy. So the interesting thing here is, okay, so what does this framework give us, right? Well, 1, we can look at a government or form of government based on the number of people that have supreme authority. What's 1, or maybe 2, the royal authority. Sparta and Rome had 2 rather than just 1. And then you had the rule of the many, the aristocrats, the best. And then you had the rule of the many, the democracy. Now, that's from Aristotle, and I think that's basically sound for all practical uses. It doesn't seem to have fallen out of favor. It doesn't seem to be inadequate to the task at hand today, whereas I think Moldbug is. 2, Plato gives us a very interesting account of how governments decay, especially oligarchy to democracy to tyranny. Since his form of ideal government has never existed, I can't really say. I don't agree with him that democracies devolve in, well, I mean, maybe they do devolve into oligarchies. Sparta in its last days did devolve into wealth-seeking, and so did Rome. So I guess that's true. So he gives a very interesting account of how these things happen. So wealth, which is a sign pointing to, so if you're a democracy, a warrior caste society like the Roman Republic or Sparta, to the extent that you had wealth, it meant that you'd taken it from someone else, right? That you had conquered them. And so that was a sign of your prowess. But then the wealth itself became mistaken for the thing that it signified. A simulation. So now Baudrillard can come in. And that led to people getting complacent and weakening the foundations for the democratic society. That itself then leads to luxury and indolence. Well, we have wealth, blah, 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 which led to, mob rule, right? And then that led to tyranny. You could sort of see this pattern in the Roman Republic, which, went through this pattern long after Plato wrote the Republic. The early Republic, which in this case was a balanced regime, but let's say it was democratic in the sense that the Romans valued honor, which is true. After the conquest of Carthage, it became an oligarchy because of all the wealth. This wealth was acquired not by industry, but by conquest. That then devolves into mob rule, where there's all sorts of dislocation in the Italian cities, in Rome itself, which then leads to the rule of a tyrant, Caesar. So we actually do sort of see the Roman decay in the fashion that Plato describes. Now, we could argue that the well-balanced Republic of Polybius's day could stand in for the aristocracy in the Platonic formula. But While he uses these words slightly differently than Aristotle, I would prefer Aristotle's usage and definition, but nonetheless, Plato still has this interesting insight. And then Polybius and Cicero and Machiavelli have this further interesting insight that while they're, see, because ultimately, why do we want a mixed? Why is the mixed government an ideal? Because if you look at each of them individually, you can find flaws, and that's what Aristotle does, especially if they're in their vicious form. So then the question is, what's the best way to handle those flaws? And Machiavelli points this out. The best way to handle these flaws is to bundle these three forms of government into a single constitution, so that where one is strong and the other's weak, that other one can step in and help. And the ideal setup is that each of these three institutions can then allow us to balance the excesses of the other. And more than just that, ideally to correct for the imbalances of the other. No classical thinker would have argued that some sort of perfect regime could ever be achieved in real life. Not like these utopian revolutionaries of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. But they did believe that striving for some sort of good objective was the goal, rather than just utility for Machiavelli, which is just make a government that works, is useful, rather than one that's striving towards some end. Now, another important concept is the idea of the common good. And this is something that I think needs some definition. When I use the term common good, this is what I mean by it. The good for which amongst all concerned it stands over and above any person's individual good. A shared conception of right and wrong that is used to resolve dispute over and above individuals. Ruling, so that's one. Ruling in such a way that one minimizes as much as possible the externalities of human behavior on others. Right? So what a tyrant does is he externalizes all the costs of his actions on the people. And he can do so because of his power. He has the power of the state. He has mercenaries and soldiers at his beck and call. He can impose costs on other people who can't impose costs on him. No one is given carte blanche to act in a promiscuous fashion at the expense of everyone. All actions need to be weighed in the balance of who is affected and steps taken accordingly. A rightly ordered social order, the one who acts is responsible for the result of his actions, not some other person. Well, in modern times, we call that skin in the game, right? You have skin in the game because you're responsible for what you do. If what you did was well, then you'll be rewarded. And if what you did was wrong, you'll be punished. And that's someone else. For large-scale decision-making such as that at the national level, this responsibility would lie with, said actor at that position, hence the weight of decision, which is a turn of phrase, the weight of decision or the weight of command. You are responsible for far more than yourself. And I would define vice much more shortly as sort of the opposite of that, acting in a fashion that all of the costs of your actions fall onto someone other than yourself. So the common good could be pursued in any of the three forms of government that Aristotle described, hence why there's virtuous forms, monarchy, aristocracy, and politia. Could also be pursued in the fourth form of government that Cicero calls the republic. And so the thing here is then, it's not so much saying that any one form of government is perfect or ideal, though I think we could say that what I would say is the fourth form of government, the mixed constitution, is the best in the sense that it has by putting the other three together, it has all of their benefits and then minimizes their defects. Now, you could envision a horribly dysfunctional fourth form of government where all the defects of the three mentioned are predominant with none of the virtue. That's also possible. That seems to be what the U.S. is at now. But it doesn't have to be, right? And that's not the ideal. I did briefly mention this sort of conception in a debate that I had with Endeavor a few years back on monarchy versus republics or something. That's an interesting conversation to listen to anyone that hasn't heard that already. That's only a small part of a large point. So then let's look at how this helps us understand America today. Because again, having read, through most of 2007 of Unqualified Reservations, Moldbug is talking about the contemporary United States. Well, if we use Plato, we see that we are clearly in the oligarchy phase, where we have a lot of wealth, and that wealth has become super abundant. People become used to it. They assume it's the natural state of things. And there's calls for the transfer and reacquisition of that wealth from the haves to the have-nots. That seems to be where we're at now in the system that Plato describes. Now, if we look at, say, Aristotle, I mean, clearly this is a vicious form of government that we have in the United States. It's probably what I would call an oligarchy, because the people that have power are the handful of the rich and powerful who own industry and other forms of assets, land, and all those things. And they're the ones that actually practically make the decisions. This is the bread and circus phase of the Roman Republic, or the Roman Empire, rather. And so, what this overlay does is it moves away from talking about just the structure of the U.S. government, which, again, there is room for that discussion. We're talking about the nature or the end to which it's directed. That end being the good of those at the top, shareholders, the technocrats, rather than the rest of us, rather than the common good. At best, they just bribe us. So there's that. The other quality that these ancient discussions bring is individual character. Much of this is talking about, Plato's Republic's about the soul and justice in the soul. Aristotle's talking about virtue and vice and being focused on the good of the whole rather than any individual good. And I think the real problem we have today is a complete inversion of all understanding of politics. The word commonwealth itself, from which we get, which is almost considered synonymous with governance, and republics, is the commonwealth. It's in the name, right? The wealth is held in common. So there's this idea of the state funds. We see this allegory in Plutarch's Life of Coriolanus and Shakespeare's play of the same name, Coriolanus, where Menenius, one of Coriolanus' friends, gives a humorous account of the state as a body, where the Senate is the stomach that eats the food, which in this case would be the tax revenue, and then distributes it to the rest of the body. And so the idea, vicious governments in all three iterations of Aristotle are those that act for the interests of the rulers, not the interests of the whole. So this idea that we can all pursue a rational self-interest and have a better society is the opposite of all political thought up until, John Locke, whether it was ancient or medieval, or even Renaissance begins to change with the likes of Machiavelli and others. But this idea that you can have a whole society rooted on vice, in this case greed, but not just greed, self-interest, and have a stable foundational society is completely antithetical to this framework of moral analysis. Moldbug says he doesn't care about morality, right? Morality, doesn't enter into politics. Well, that's just bad political theory. Good political theory has to include and incorporate an understanding of what a moral system ought to be. Or right? You can't have a common good or shared vision by definition if everybody's pursuing their own self-interest. It makes political life impossible, because there's nothing over and above any of the desires of any individual. And of course, if you pursue your self-interest, what do you do? Well, your entire goal is to externalize all the costs of your actions onto someone else, which is vice. And that leads to all sorts of political friction and all sorts of political instability. The other thing that we see is from that I would include in my political framework is an insight that Edmund Burke shares with Machiavelli from the Discourse on the French Revolution. And he says, and I quote, "A further conclusion about the nature of political theory follows. The science of constructing a commonwealth or renovating it or reforming it is, like every other experimental science, not to be taught a priori, nor is it a short experience that can instruct us in that practical science. Morality and political theory may enlighten us on the ultimate ends of social life, but the means thereunto are the object of a practical science that relies on experience. Who then shall make the practical judgments of politics? The question cannot be answered by appealing to the rights of man. Men have no right to what is not reasonable and to what is not for their benefit. But as to what is for their benefit," Burke said, "the will of the many and their interests may very often differ." The first duty of a statesman is indeed to provide for the multitude, but because it is the multitude and is therefore, as such, the first object in all institutions. But the object is the good of the people, not the performance of their will. The duties of the statesman, in consequence, do not belong by right to those whom they have chosen, but ought to be performed by those qualified by virtue and wisdom, actual or presumptive, for the task of government. Yeah, that's another interesting point here, too. And I brought this up earlier when I made the distinction that there's a mistake when people talk about democratic forms of decision-making processes and the sovereignty of the people. Right? Modern political thought argues the people, not God or the gods, is sovereign. And so Burke makes the distinction about what is good for the people and the people's will. So the people's will, vox populi, vox Dei, is an expression of popular sovereignty, which is, French Revolution. We saw this earlier with parts of the American Revolution. That's not the same as what their actual good is, right? The actual common good might not actually be what they will. Maybe they themselves are vicious, in which case modern political thought of the left, if you will, diverges tremendously from ancient political thought. Whereas, ancient political thought was not that you just give in to the people's will at any moment. No serious philosopher at the time who put his pen to the paper on the issue of politics said that was the goal. Tyrants might have played to the masses, they usually do, but they don't have a political theory to justify it, just their own self-interest. And so what we see here is this idea that governance is for some goal external to not only the ruler himself, but the people. Now, we don't have that anymore in the West. It used to be Christianity of some form. Now it's individual self-interest, which is by definition vicious and by definition incompatible with any sort of public life. So there's a reason why there's this political failing, right? So back to my disagreement with Moldbug. You can't take the moral out of the political. It's essential. It's what makes the political. It's the same mistake that Jack Donovan does. You can't make a distinction between being a good man and being good at being a man. A being good at being a man means staying awake during your watch, which if you're intemperate and drink too much and fall asleep or are in a stupor and can't give a warning, then you're not being good at being a man. And you're not being good at being a man because you're not a good man. Okay, you can't make the distinction. And the same goes for politics. And not Machiavelli. Moldbug makes the same mistake. You just can't do that. And again, if you read the section in Book 8 of the Republic where Plato specifically talks about how a democracy arises out of an oligarchy and leads to all sorts of excesses, it sounds like he's talking about 21st century America. It's amazing how much these patterns appear throughout history. Obviously, 21st century America is a rather extreme case of this malaise, but nonetheless, it still follows this predictable pattern, right? And so another useful reason for considering these tools for political analysis is that modernity has said, well, we've escaped, the old ways. We've escaped the patterns of behavior of all prior civilizations. We've reinvented the wheel. It's all brand new and it's going to work. The thing is, despite all the wealth, all the technology, all the propaganda, we're seeing the old patterns reassert themselves. Granted, they're being reasserted in some rather strange ways because they're being reasserted within this bizarre hellscape we're living in now. But they are coming back. And that's the thing. They're always going to come back. So what a rooting in this understanding of political science does for us is it helps us take a long-term picture of how societies can decay over time, how one ought to think about building institutions and identities for those institutions, for the governing of a people, and how to ensure that can be maintained for as long as possible. Right, because somebody might say, some smart aleck might say, well, you can't build a perfect political order. And it's like, well, okay. I mean, So what? I mean, without a political order, you can't have life itself. It's just, like we saw in England with the succession crises of Stephen and Matilda, the anarchy, and the War of the Roses. It's just bedlam. It's just anarchy in the pejorative sense, not in the technical political sense. That's all you have. And you can't have any organized life in the situation. And what we've learned is you can't have any sort of organized life if the pursuit of rational self-interest is your central objective. Because from the highest to the lowest, if everybody thinks that way, those that have wealth and power will use that to externalize the costs onto all of us, which they've done. But eventually, as with all civilizations that try this, that won't work. They can do it, well, I was going to say they can do it longer because they have more money and wealth than ever before, but technology is an accelerant that speeds things up. So maybe not. Maybe it'll fall faster when it finally falls. But you can't do that either. Furthermore, there's a sort of more balanced approach to classical political thought and the way it analyzes these issues. Rather than saying, for example, the left looks at everything through just one lens, capitalism, wealth. Well, that's an important one. I wouldn't say it's the only one. And that tends to be used overmuch. On the right, they tend to more or less totally ignore wealth in favor of other things, cultural power, state power. Okay, those things are also influential, but you can't therefore exclude wealth. They're not blinkered. Plato, Aristotle, Polybius, and Cicero aren't blinkered. They don't have this overly arbitrarily narrow framework of analysis. And this is one of the things that over the years has sort of soured me on all forms of modern political analysis. Is, growing up and in college, I read a lot of these political thinkers, or, either directly or through secondary sources. And I'm like, well, this is all very well thought out, universal perspective. And then there's these modern philosophies, Marxism, libertarianism, socialism, neoconservatism, etc., which have these overly narrow and arbitrarily blinkered frameworks, which are just completely inadequate to the task at hand, because they can't explain the problem because they can't see the whole picture. They arbitrarily cut themselves off from the whole picture. And we don't want any of that. And ultimately, that's what Moldbug does, right? Moldbug is this kind of crypto-libertarian who ignores entirely the power of wealth in society and has this, laughable notion that, a blue-haired gender studies feminist professor in university has more power than Bill Gates, who literally ran an initiative. Now, granted, this is 2020, not 2007, who ran an initiative to get the entire world vaccinated. Okay, is anybody who's working as a gender studies professor at a university got that kind of power? No, not even close. The other thing is, many of these people got fired. If you didn't get the memo and you're still just a TERF, well, you're out. Boom. If you were a doctor and didn't get the memo about the new definition of a vaccine, boom, you're out. So why would these people, if these people were in charge, they wouldn't fire themselves. That's stupid. Clearly, they're not the ones in charge. They're just patsies. The people in charge, now I would argue, are technocratic elite, which are technically a group of people that did not exist in the ancient world. And this is a generally new thing. This could be the fifth form of government. If the fourth is the mixed constitution, the fifth is the rule of technicians. Because it's both how they rule, to what end they rule, are just so far outside the scope of almost anybody thinking back then that they wouldn't have even terms for it. It's just so outside of their perception. So hopefully this has helped explain to a lot of people the sort of political framework that I use when I address these issues, as well as what differentiates me from Moldbug in this regard. Because while obviously those of us that have been watching the Moldbug show know what I don't like about Moldbug, they don't necessarily know what methodology I would use or convince others to use instead of Moldbugs. And I hope this is a general introduction to that. Obviously, a far more deeper investigation of any one of these political theorists could take many, many episodes, which was beyond the scope or intent of tonight's episode. Let's check out the chat. Zeus, Zeoscience, hello. Evidence violates community guidelines. Maybe that's also the empathetic diagnosis. I don't remember what that one's referring to. That was a while ago. Let's see. Evidence violates community guidelines. Best GOV today must be with reducing or eliminating excessive assistance from one of our greatest allies. Manoan, stream between POF and Endeavor. Thanks for putting that in the chat. JLM, howdy. Paul Moosefoot, hello. Bullfrog VA, hello. Paul Moosefoot, people just never change and they always use the same Atlantis Babylonian playbook. Maybe it goes far back as Go Lucky Teppy. Yeah. Yeah, well, the technical term that we're going to use for this is Babel. Even, was it, can't think of his name now. But yeah, Revolution. Kerry Bolton, who wrote Revolution from Above, also wrote a book called Babel Inc., describing the global economic order. I have a copy. I just haven't got around to reading it yet, but I do approve of this title. Godward Podcast. If America is comparable to Rome, what year are we at? Around year 0 yet? Maybe not. Maybe even later. Well, no, we're not even in the Caesar stage, right? We're not even in the Civil War stage. If there's any similarity between America and Rome, this might be around the time of the Cracky. We're not even in open war yet. So that's could be coming. Manoan, many very educated people have given crap answers. Yeah, they have, and that's because they're paid, right? I mean, they're just paid off. Right? They're not going to say something to the audience that will upset the people that sign their checks and give them their payroll. And so keep that in mind too. Paul Moosefoot, future is really hard to predict, but these cycles are undeniable. Yes. The cycles repeat, the patterns repeat, but not the actors aren't the same, the countries aren't the same, etc. Manoan, a massive bureaucracy is a modern invention. Yes, facilitated by technology. Kai Mokata, will you ever do a stream on the modern diet? Also love the streams. Thanks. Yeah, I actually will. I haven't got anything definitive yet, but like myself, there's another one of my friends who's very much against seed oils, Iron Age agriculturist, who on Twitter. He also is the one who's very much against seed oils. He also goes by Furious Pertinax on YouTube. So hopefully one day we can do a joint dunking on seed oil stream. Let's see. Minoan, any thoughts on England's travel through governments? Yeah. So, one, if we look at England as being rooted in the Anglo-Saxon conquest and beginning in the 5th century AD, we could say that in its early phases, say from those conquests till Harold Godwinson in 1066, it was a monarchy in the sense that it was a political rule in the interests of the people ruled. So Harold Godwinson's forces that resisted William were English yeomen. These were Englishmen recruited to fight. The Normans are tyrants, hence the concept of the Norman yoke. The Normans are French. They're exploiting England for their own wars in France and the Crusades, you think like Richard I. And they rely on foreign troops, Norman troops. That eventually begins to change. By the 100 Years' War, Henry V at Agincourt, most of his troops are raised in England. In fact, the rise of the longbowmen in England was unique in Western Europe at the time because of just how good a relation the king had with his people. It's not that France or Spain or the Holy Roman Empire could not have copied that strategy, especially since it was so effective. You wonder why they didn't. Well, it was political control, right? A yeoman citizenry armed with the longbow was quite effective at killing knights, aristocrats, and even possibly the king, which would jeopardize the political structures in France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire if enough people were armed that way. So they were tyrannical governments, whereas the Normans were transitioning into a more, quote, monarchy where they were trusting the people. They eventually, killed themselves off in the War of the Roses, which led to the Tudors. And then they died out with Elizabeth, which led to the Stuarts, who were Scots. Again, foreigners, therefore tyrants. And then finally, there's the Civil War. The Stuarts get overthrown. The Stuarts come back. And then the Stuarts get kicked out one last time with the Glorious Revolution, which is basically, king for hire, William of Orange. Again, foreigners ruling England. England's been under tyranny for a very long time. Really since 1066 in my book, if we use this classical analysis. So everyone, that's all I have for tonight. I hope this was helpful in explaining my political framework of analysis, not so much my ideal form of government, but just how I look at politics throughout history and in the present day, and how I use that to map and model and describe what we see. So make sure to tune in tomorrow at the same time for a discussion that I'm going to do on a mini-series on The Machine Stops by Ian Forster. A lot of great stuff there too. And hold on, right before I leave off, there's another interesting quote here, comment. Vanderlei Media, King David of Israel. Based on what I've heard Todd Lewis say, I'd guess the summary is BAP has misunderstood the Bronze Age Hellenic mindset as being nihilistic, hedonistic, pro-war for its own sake. Absolutely. Someone watched my early video on the casual stream. I think it was episode 2. So, thanks again, everyone. And make sure to tune in tomorrow, 6 o'clock, for my series, the first episode of my series on The Machine Stops. This is Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast, signing off.